1914, Brazil. Their graves were empty, but their hearts were preserved. The Goiás Cemetery Report. The night in Goiás was never truly silent. The crickets hummed, the church bell sometimes swayed in the wind, and the trees groaned as though burdened with secrets too heavy for their branches. But in 1914, silence took on a new shape inside the town's cemetery. People swore they could hear whispers from the soil, faint and trembling, as though the dead were trying to speak. At first, no one dared admit it. Farmers walking home late said the air grew heavy near the gates. A widow passing the cemetery swore she heard her husband's voice, calling from beneath the earth. The sound was not a cry, not a scream, just a hushed murmur, like lips pressed against the wood of a coffin. By day, the cemetery looked ordinary, rows of wooden crosses leaning into the Brazilian sun. But by night, the shadows seemed too long, the air too cold. Some said the ground shifted, as though the graves themselves were restless. The whispers grew louder each week. The first clue came when children began avoiding the path near the graveyard. They whispered of pale lights glowing between the crosses, of strange shapes kneeling in prayer at midnight, only to vanish when approached. Mothers pulled their children closer. Men carried lanterns, but still, the whispers returned. Then came the smell. Sweet at first, almost floral, then sour like decay. Yet when the graves were checked, the earth showed no signs of rot. The scent seemed to come from nowhere, drifting across the cemetery like a perfume of death. The fear spread fast. Goiás was a small town, and secrets didn't stay hidden for long. Some believed it was the work of restless spirits. Others whispered of grave robbers. But the whispers didn't sound like thieves. They sounded like pleading. They sounded like sorrow. The priest warned the people against superstition, reminding them that cemeteries were holy places. But when the moon was high and the clouds slid away, even he avoided the iron gate. His sermons grew harsher, as though he feared losing control of his flock. And then, one stormy night, the earth gave up its first truth. A violent rain lashed Goiás, turning the cemetery soil into mud. By morning, one of the graves had collapsed inward. Villagers rushed to see, lanterns shaking in their hands. But when the mud was cleared, horror stole their voices. The coffin was empty, though it showed no sign of breakage, no digging, no claw marks. It was as though the body had simply vanished. Even stranger, at the coffin's center lay something no one could explain, a human heart, preserved perfectly, red and glistening as if it still beat. The whispers now had meaning. The dead were not resting. And this was only the beginning. The discovery shook Goiás like an earthquake. An empty grave meant more than just a body missing. It meant something unnatural had taken place. The townspeople gathered around the pit, staring into the coffin that should have held a man named Joaquim Duarte. He had been buried only 6 months earlier, after dying from a sudden fever. Everyone remembered the funeral. They had watched the casket lowered into the earth. They had thrown soil over it with their own hands. Now there was no body. Only the heart remained. The heart was the strangest part. It was not shriveled or blackened by time. It was whole, moist, and red, as if pulled from a chest only moments before. Even in the morning sun, it glistened with a terrible life. Some villagers crossed themselves, whispering that it was a sign from God. Others backed away, muttering of curses and devilry. Children were dragged home, their mothers refusing to let them near the cemetery again. The priest arrived soon after, holding his rosary tight. He ordered everyone to step back. His voice trembled, though he tried to sound firm. He said it was a test of faith, a mystery only the church could explain. He demanded the heart be taken to the chapel, but no one volunteered to touch it. Finally, a young gravedigger wrapped it in cloth and carried it away. The crowd watched him walk, some weeping, others staring in stunned silence. That night, fear seeped deeper into Goiás. In every home, lanterns burned longer than usual. Doors were bolted, windows locked. Families huddled together, as if the darkness outside had teeth. The whispers in the cemetery did not stop. They grew louder. Some swore they heard more than whispers now. They claimed they heard footsteps on gravel, shovels scraping earth, coffins creaking open. But when the gate was checked, the lock was untouched. Rumors multiplied. A few villagers whispered that Joachim had risen from his grave, cursed to wander. Others believed someone had stolen his body for witchcraft, leaving behind the heart as proof of unholy rites. But the most terrifying belief spread quietly, like smoke, that Joachim's body had not been stolen at all. It had simply vanished. 3 nights later, a woman screamed outside her window. She said she saw Joachim standing in the cemetery. His face pale, his clothes still dirt-stained, but his eyes alive. He did not move. He only stared. When others ran to see, nothing was there, only shadows. The priest warned the town not to fall into hysteria, but even he kept his doors locked that night. The following morning, another grave caved in after heavy rain. Again, the coffin was empty. Again, a heart lay preserved inside. The cemetery was no longer a place of rest. It was a place of terror. And Goiás would soon learn that these empty graves were only the surface of a much darker secret. By the time the 3rd grave gave way, no one in Goiás doubted something unholy was at work. Each time it rained, the earth seemed eager to reveal another horror. Another coffin opened, another body missing, another heart left behind, intact, gleaming, defying time itself. The villagers began to notice a pattern. The bodies were all taken from those who had died suddenly, fevers, accidents, drownings. Not the elderly, not the sickly. As if some unseen force was choosing only those whose lives had been cut short, unfinished, their stories stolen too soon. The hearts lay in their coffins like accusations, red against the pale wood. The pulsing, some swore as if alive. Doctors from nearby towns were summoned. Men in stiff coats and spectacles arrived, their notebooks clutched tightly. They examined the hearts, prodding them with metal instruments. Their verdict was chilling. The organs showed no decay. No drinho, no hot, no descoloração. Impossible, they muttered. Flesh should wither within days. Yet these hearts were preserved as though embalmed by a hand more skilled than science. But there was no embalming fluid, no chemicals, no explanation. The doctors left Goiás unsettled, their faces pale. None stayed overnight. None dared. For the townsfolk, science was no comfort. At night, they whispered that the hearts were alive, still tied to their owners. That Joachim and the others had not died at all, but been taken, pulled from their graves by something that wanted their flesh, leaving only the pieces it could not consume. Some claimed to hear the hearts beating when the chapel was quiet. Soft, steady, unnatural. The gravedigger, who had touched the first heart, confessed that he could feel warmth through the cloth. He swore it moved faintly, like a muscle twitching beneath skin. Fear turned to hysteria. Mothers refused to let their children near the church. Farmers carried knives when walking past the cemetery at dusk. Even the strongest men avoided the graves at night. But hearts were not the only things that defied the earth. One morning, footprints appeared in the cemetery mud. Bare, human prints. They led away from the graves, but there were no return tracks. They vanished into the road that wound through Goiás. The villagers followed the trail with dread. It passed the well, crossed the square, and ended outside an abandoned house at the edge of town. The door hung open. The walls smelled of damp and ash. But inside, nothing was found, only silence and a scattering of soil on the floor. The footprints told a story no one wanted to believe, that the dead had walked among them. The priest clung to his sermons with desperate fire, insisting the hearts were divine signs, reminders of eternal life. But even he avoided looking too long at the preserved organs. Even he locked the chapel doors at night. And as the rains returned, the town waited with dread, because they knew the earth would not keep its secrets much longer. The arrival of doctors should have brought comfort. Men of science, armed with reason, instruments, and answers. But instead, their presence only deepened the dread. They came from Rio Verde in Anápolis, summoned by urgent letters filled with desperate pleas. Goiás needed proof, some rational explanation for the hearts that refused to rot, for the bodies that slipped through the earth like mist. The doctors entered the cemetery at dawn, their boots crunching over gravel, their faces set with determination. They carried leather bags filled with scalpels, glass jars, and notebooks. Some villagers followed at a distance, unable to look away. When the first coffin was opened before them, silence fell. Inside, a heart rested like a jewel, its surface still glistening, as though it had never stopped living. They lifted it carefully, turning it in the light. One man pressed his ear against it. He jerked back as though burned. He swore he heard a beat. Another doctor cut into the flesh, expecting it to collapse into mush. Instead, the knife slid as if through fresh tissue. The walls of the heart remained firm, resilient. The chambers still held dark traces of blood. It was impossible. One doctor muttered about natural preservation, perhaps minerals in the soil. Another suggested poisons in the air, some strange property of Goiás itself. But none could explain why only the hearts remained, why every other part of the body was gone without a trace. They collected samples, sealing pieces of tissue into glass jars. The villagers watched as if curses were being bottled. Some whispered that the doctors would carry the plague of Goiás back to their own cities. That night, the doctors stayed in town. Lanterns glowed in the inn as they argued in low voices, their notes scattered across the table. They wrote of unheard-of preservation, of anomalies beyond science. But again and again, they returned to the same phrase: the silence cannot be explained. For it was not only the silence of the graves that troubled them. It was the silence of the bodies. No signs of struggle. No claw marks on the lids of coffins. No holes in the earth. The bodies had vanished without resistance, as if taken gently, without sound. The silence was worse than screams. Screams could be explained. Silence could not. By morning, one of the jars was missing. The doctors searched their bags, the tables, the floors. Nothing. The innkeeper swore he had heard footsteps outside during the night, but when he looked, the street was empty. Panic spread. If someone had stolen preserved flesh, what did they intend to do with it? Rituals? Experiments? Theories grew wild. That same morning, another grave collapsed in the cemetery. The coffin was empty. Another heart remained. The doctors left Goiás the following day, their notes incomplete, their faces drawn. They promised to write reports, to return with answers. But they never came back. Their silence joined the silence of the graves. And Goiás was left alone with its terror. The doctors had gone. Their absence left a heavier shadow than their presence ever had. Goiás was once again on its own, left with the hearts, the empty graves, and the whispers that grew louder with each passing night. The townsfolk no longer spoke of it in open daylight. To mention the cemetery was to invite stares, to summon fear. But behind closed doors, in kitchens lit by candlelight, in barns smelling of hay, the whispers spread. Some said the dead were walking among them. Others claimed witches were harvesting bodies for rituals, leaving the hearts behind as tokens of power. The old women muttered of curses born in blood, curses that clung to the soil of Goiás since the days of conquest. The younger men, braver with drink, muttered darker theories. They said someone in town had made a pact. That the missing bodies weren't stolen by ghosts or demons, but by human hands. Fear divided the town. Neighbors eyed one another with suspicion. Farmers who had once shared tools and labor now locked their barns, watching the roads with narrowed eyes. Children were forbidden from playing near the cemetery, but curiosity proved stronger than fear. A group of boys snuck in one night, carrying stolen lanterns. They returned pale, trembling, refusing to speak. One boy's hair turned gray in a single streak, as though the night had branded him. He never set foot near the cemetery again. Women whispered about the widows who still visited the graves of their husbands, kneeling on the soil, pressing their ears to the earth as if listening for a heartbeat. The town was unraveling. Whispers carried even darker weight when paired with sightings. A man swore he saw Joaquim Duarte, the first missing body, wandering near the river. His clothes were torn, his skin pale, his eyes glassy. But when the man blinked, Joaquim was gone. Another claimed to see a woman in white walking between the rows of graves, her face veiled by her long hair. She disappeared when approached, leaving only the smell of damp soil and roses. Each story added fuel to the fire. Goiás no longer trusted its own eyes. Soon, the whispers turned toward the priest. Why was he so desperate to keep the hearts locked inside the chapel? Why did he forbid anyone to look at them again? Some villagers believed he was protecting them. Others believed he was hiding the truth. It didn't help that his sermons grew harsher, filled with warnings of hellfire and punishment. He thundered about faith while sweat dripped from his brow. People began to wonder, was he guiding them, or was he guilty of something unspeakable? And as suspicion grew, so did the whispers. For whispers in a small town are like smoke. They slip under doors, they curl around walls, and they always find the ones they seek to burn. The priest had stood at the heart of Goiás for years. He baptized the children, buried the dead, and offered comfort when sickness swept through the town. But after the empty graves began to appear, something in him shifted. His sermons grew darker, more desperate, as though he was battling not just for his parishioners' souls, but for his own. Then one night, a group of altar boys made a discovery. While cleaning the chapel, they stumbled upon a leather-bound book tucked behind the altar, hidden beneath cloth and dust. It was old, its cover cracked, its pages filled with hurried writing. The boys, curious and afraid, showed it to a church elder. Within hours, whispers of its existence spread through Goiás. The priest's journal. The townsfolk demanded answers. At first, the priest denied it, saying it was private, meaningless, the ramblings of a man at prayer. But the journal spoke louder than his trembling voice. Its pages revealed a man haunted. He wrote of the nights when he, too, heard whispers rising from the earth. He confessed to walking through the cemetery at midnight, clutching his rosary so tightly his hands bled. One passage chilled the town. The bodies do not rest. They are called away, though I do not know by whom. I have seen shadows lift from the graves, carrying with them what once was flesh. Yet the hearts remain, always the hearts, as if some covenant spares only that which holds love. The journal also spoke of dreams. Terrible, vivid dreams that plagued the priest's sleep. Dreams of the dead standing outside his window, their mouths moving but no sound escaping. Dreams of hearts beating in his hands, warm and heavy, while unseen voices begged him to guard them. He admitted that he kept the hearts in the chapel not for protection, but because he feared what would happen if they left holy ground. He believed they were anchors, holding back something that wanted more, something that might one day return for the living. The townsfolk recoiled in fear and anger. Some accused the priest of witchcraft, of consorting with the very evil he warned them against. Others clung to him more tightly, begging him to continue guarding the hearts. But the damage was done. The discovery of the journal meant trust was broken. No longer could the people see him only as their shepherd. He was now a man tainted by secrets, a man who admitted to watching the dead rise and said nothing. And yet, there was something more terrifying in those pages. A final note, scrawled in shaking ink. The hearts will not hold forever. The day will come when the earth takes back what it has spared. On that day, pray we are not the ones left behind. The priest locked himself in the chapel that night. And the townsfolk of Goiás, clutching their children and lighting their candles, waited in silence for what might come. By the summer of 1914, Goiás was no longer the quiet town it had once been. Fear hung in the streets like a sickness. The children no longer played in the square. The market stalls emptied before noon. Families kept their shutters closed, their prayers whispered quickly, as if afraid the night itself might overhear them. The cemetery, once a place of mourning, was now avoided like a pit of fire. Grass grew tall along the fence. Weeds claimed the pathways. Only the gravedigger dared approach, and even he no longer whistled as he worked. He kept his head low, his shovel striking the soil with dull thuds, as though afraid to wake something sleeping beneath. And yet, no one could ignore the whispers. At night, the voices grew bolder. People claimed they no longer came from the ground, but from the air itself, drifting through windows and cracks in the doors. Some described them as pleading, some as angry. A few swore the whispers carried names, names of the dead, spoken like a summons. The town's dogs barked through the night, staring at empty roads, hackles raised. Horses refused to pass the cemetery gates. Even the birds that once sang at dawn grew silent, their absence another omen. The hearts in the chapel pulsed in rumor and imagination. Though locked away, they consumed every thought. Did they still beat? Could they hear? What would happen when their silence ended? The journal had split the town. Half believed the priest had saved them, that by guarding the hearts, he kept Goiás safe from something worse. The other half believed he had doomed them, that by keeping such relics of death, he was binding the town to a curse it could never escape. The arguments spilled into the streets. Men shouted at one another in the square. Women clutched their children tighter, blaming neighbors for sins never spoken. And beneath it all was the growing dread that no one voiced aloud. What if the bodies came back? The rains returned in August. Heavy, unrelenting storms that turned the roads to rivers and the cemetery to mud. With each downpour, the townsfolk braced themselves for another grave to collapse. They waited for the news of another empty coffin, another heart gleaming in the morning light. But this time something worse happened. A boy vanished. He was last seen near the well at dusk, carrying a bucket for his mother. When the family called for him, only silence answered. The bucket was found the next morning, tipped on its side, the water spilled into the dirt. Some whispered he had fallen into the well. Others said he had been taken by the same force that stole the bodies from their graves. And from that night on, the whispers changed. They no longer carried the weight of sorrow. They carried hunger. The governor's office had finally taken notice. Too many letters, too many frantic accounts from Goiás had reached Rio. Officials sent a small team to investigate. A magistrate, a clerk, and a military escort of 3 men. They promised answers. They promised order. For 2 weeks, they stayed in town, interviewing families, reading the priest's journal, examining the hearts in the chapel. They took careful notes, filling page after page with testimony. They visited the graves at night, lanterns in hand, though their faces showed the fear they tried to hide. The magistrate assured the people that their suffering would not be forgotten. A full report would be sent to Rio de Janeiro. Goiás would no longer carry its burden alone. But the town never saw that report. On the night before their departure, the officials locked their papers in a leather case. The clerk tucked it beneath his bed at the inn. Soldiers posted themselves at the door. No one entered. No one left. And yet by dawn, the case was gone. The clerk woke screaming, his hands trembling. He swore he had felt a presence in the room during the night, a shadow leaning over him, cold breath against his ear. He thought it was a dream, until he saw the empty floor where the case had been. The soldiers, ashamed and angry, tore apart the room. They searched the inn, the square, even the chapel. Nothing. The report had vanished, as if it had never existed. Rumors flew. Some said the priest himself had taken it, desperate to hide truths too dark for paper. Others swore the dead had risen not for flesh this time, but for words. That even in death, they wanted silence. The magistrate was shaken. He ordered the soldiers to keep their findings secret, to say nothing of what they had witnessed. That morning, without ceremony, the officials left Goiás. They promised to return. They never did. The townsfolk were left with nothing but whispers and the knowledge that even the government had been silenced. That night, something new crept into the air. The whispers in the cemetery did not just echo from the earth or drift through the streets. They began to rise inside homes. Families heard them in their walls, their attics, their bedrooms. The voices carried questions now. Soft, chilling questions. Why do you keep our hearts? Why do you not follow? No one slept that night. Lanterns burned until dawn, but no flame could chase away the voices. Goiás had become a town haunted not just by graves, but by words stolen, hearts preserved, and truths buried deeper than the dead themselves. By September, The skies above Goiás seemed to carry their own vengeance. Rains fell harder, longer, turning streets into rivers and hillsides into streams of red mud. The townsfolk whispered that heaven itself was trying to wash the town clean. But the rain revealed more than it destroyed. On one storm-swept night, thunder shook the cemetery gates from their hinges. By morning, the soil had collapsed across an entire row of graves. What lay beneath made even the bravest men fall silent. The coffins were empty. Every one of them. Only hearts remained, 13 in total, arranged neatly in their boxes like offerings. Some glistened red, others blackened and shriveled, as if drained of whatever had kept them alive. It was not random anymore. It was deliberate. The gravedigger fell to his knees, sobbing into the mud. He swore the earth had moved on its own, heaving like a chest drawing breath. Others backed away, crossing themselves, their boots sinking into the waterlogged ground. The priest arrived, clutching his journal, his eyes wide with terror. He said nothing, only pressed his rosary to his lips and trembled. When asked to explain, he muttered only one phrase, "It is beginning." That evening, the town gathered in the chapel, the hearts displayed on the altar like relics of horror. The villagers demanded answers. Why were the hearts multiplying? What force kept them whole? What did it want? Lightning cracked outside as the priest finally spoke. His voice shook, but his words were clear. The rain is not cleansing us. It is uncovering us. The earth has chosen to show us what it has hidden. These hearts, they're not gifts. They are warnings. Gasps filled the chapel. Mothers clutched their children closer. Men gripped their knives as if they could fight what had no flesh. But the priest was not finished. He confessed that in his dreams, the rain always came before the return. The earth would not keep its secret forever. One day, he believed, the bodies would come back for what had been left behind. That night, few dared return home. Families slept on pews, praying, the storm raging outside. But when dawn came and the rain eased, something was discovered that froze their prayers in their throats. Footprints, not just one or two, but dozens pressed into the mud outside the chapel. Bare feet, small and large, all pointing toward the church, as if an entire crowd had stood in silence, listening at the walls while the town prayed inside. And among them, one set of footprints trailed blood. By the final months of 1914, Goiás was no longer just a town of fear, it was a town of secrets. Secrets carved into the soil, whispered through the walls, and pressed into the hearts that would not die. The footprints outside the chapel were the last sign anyone could deny. Children's feet, women's, men's. The dead had come, and they had listened. Some villagers swore they saw figures at the edges of the square that dawn, dripping with mud, faces pale, eyes dark and hollow. Others refused to speak of it, covering their windows with cloth, as though denial itself could keep them safe. But the truth would not stay buried. The priest's journal grew more frantic. He wrote of nights when he woke to the sound of breathing in his room, only to find no one there, of hearts that pulsed louder in the chapel, echoing like drums. He admitted he no longer prayed for salvation. He prayed only that Goiás would be forgotten by the world, hidden from any who might stumble into its curse. Yet the world had already taken notice. Letters sent to Rio and Sao Paulo carried rumors that Goiás was cursed, a place where the dead walked and the living were marked. Merchants stopped coming. Travelers turned away. The town grew isolated, as though the world itself wanted nothing to do with its secret. Then came the night the hearts were stolen. No door had been broken, no lock forced. Yet when the priest entered the chapel at dawn, the altar was bare. Every preserved heart was gone. Panic swept the town. Who had taken them? Where were they now? The priest collapsed at the altar, clutching the empty space where the relics had been. He whispered over and over, "They have reclaimed what was theirs." That same night, the whispers ceased. The cemetery grew silent. For the first time in months, the town slept without voices crawling through the dark. But it was not peace. It was dread, the dread of silence too deep, like the pause before a storm. Days later, the rain stopped. The air grew heavy, unmoving, the town trapped in a waiting stillness. Goiás became a place of locked doors, shuttered windows, and eyes that never stopped watching the horizon. And then, one final entry appeared in the priest's journal. His handwriting was jagged, frantic. The hearts are gone. The bodies are no longer bound. If this is Reed, know this. It was never about the dead. It was about us, the living. We kept their hearts, and so we kept their love, their grief, their rage. Now that bond is broken. They will come, not as we remember them, but as something else. Something that belongs neither to God nor to man. No one saw the priest again after that night. His house was found empty, his bed unslept in, his rosary left behind on the floor. The story of Goiás faded into rumor, into whispers told by candlelight. But travelers even years later spoke of the cemetery on the hill, where the soil never grew grass again, where no birds sang, where the air was always cold. And in the silence, if one dared to listen long enough, some swore they could still hear it. Hearts beating beneath the earth.